What if the most brilliant military minds could still spectacularly fumble a winning hand? The Battle of Vimeiro offers a shocking answer. Explore the incredible true story of how British commanders nearly squandered a decisive victory, altering the course of a crucial conflict. To understand the magnitude of the error committed at Vimeiro, one must first understand the desperate state of affairs in the summer of 1808. Europe was suffocating under the grip of Napoleon Bonaparte. The French emperor had redrawn the map of the continent, shattering the old empires and installing his relatives and marshals upon the thrones of Europe. Britain stood alone, an island fortress protected by the wooden walls of the Royal Navy, but impotent on land. For years, the British Army had been the laughingstock of European military salons. A small, disorganized colonial police force that seemed incapable of standing against the sheer mass and geometric precision of the French Grande Armée. The weak point in Napoleon's continental system, the blockade designed to strangle British trade, was Portugal. It was Britain's oldest ally, a stubborn strip of land on the edge of the Atlantic that refused to bow to Paris. In late 1807, Napoleon lost patience. He dispatched General Jean-Andoche Junot, a man of fierce ambition and ruthless efficiency, to march across Spain and seize Lisbon. Junot did so with terrifying speed. By 1808, the French tricolor flew over the castles of Lisbon, and the Portuguese royal family had fled to Brazil. The French stranglehold was complete, or so it seemed, but the French occupation was brittle. Junot's army was experienced, hardened by campaigns in the east, but they were stretched thin, trying to suppress a population that despised them. The rugged, sun-baked hills of Portugal were alive with insurrection. It was into this volatile powder keg that the British government decided to insert a burning match. They authorized an expeditionary force, a gamble to open a second front and prove that the British soldier could fight on the European mainland. The man chosen to lead the initial landing was Lieutenant General Sir Arthur Wellesley. At this stage in history, he was not yet the Duke of Wellington, the Iron Duke who would topple Napoleon. He was merely a successful commander from the wars in India, disparagingly referred to by Napoleon as a sepoy general, implying his victories were only against disorganized Asiatic tribes and that he would crumble against modern European tactics. Wellesley landed his force at Mondego Bay in early August 1808. The operation was a logistical nightmare, with soldiers, horses and cannons being rowed ashore through the crashing Atlantic surf. Wellesley was a man possessed by a unique urgency. He knew something that his soldiers did not. He was technically the commander of this expedition, but only temporarily. The British government, in a fit of bureaucratic absurdity, had appointed two other generals to supersede him, Sir Harry Burrard and Sir Hugh Dalrymple. These men were senior to Wellesley on the army list, archaic figures from a bygone era of warfare, cautious, elderly and plodding. They were currently sailing slowly from England and Gibraltar to take command. Wellesley understood the tactical arithmetic perfectly. He had perhaps days, maybe only hours, before these senior officers arrived to shackle his initiative with their caution. If he was to strike a blow against Junot, if he was to prove that his vision of a modern, disciplined British army could defeat the French, he had to force a battle immediately. He had to march on Lisbon and goad Junot into a fight before the ships carrying Burrard appeared on the horizon. The stakes could not have been higher. This was not just a skirmish for a few miles of rocky terrain. This was the test case for the entire Peninsular War. A victory here would galvanize the Portuguese resistance, secure a British foothold on the continent, and send a shockwave through the courts of Europe. A defeat, however, would likely result in the British army being driven back into the sea, a humiliation that would embolden Napoleon and perhaps end Britain's ability to wage land war for a generation. Wellesley moved his men south, hugging the coast to stay close to the supply ships, his eyes scanning the ocean for the sails of his superiors and scanning the hills for the glint of French bayonets. He stopped at the village of Vimeiro to cover the landing of reinforcements, And it was there that Juno, arrogant and eager to crush the British leopards, came to find him. The village of Vimeiro sat nested in a valley, bisected by a small river and surrounded by a series of rolling ridges that dominated the landscape. To an untrained eye, it was merely picturesque Portuguese countryside, dotted with olive groves and vineyards. To Arthur Wellesley, it was a weapon. He understood that in modern warfare, the ground itself fought alongside the soldier. He deployed his army not in a show of force upon the summits, but with a deception that would become his tactical signature: the reverse slope defense. Wellesley positioned the bulk of his infantry on the backside of the ridges, completely hidden from the approaching enemy. Any French observer scanning the British lines with a telescope would see only a thin screen of skirmishers and a few artillery batteries exposed on the crests. The main body of the British army, thousands of redcoats with muskets primed, lay flat in the grass on the reverse slopes, sheltered from the terrifying ricochet of French cannonballs, and, more importantly, invisible. It was a coiled spring, waiting for the boot of the enemy to trigger it. On the morning of August 21st, General Junot arrived on the field. The French commander surveyed the scene with a dangerous mixture of impatience and contempt. In his eyes, the British were cornered against the sea, protecting their landing site. He saw what appeared to be a weak, scattered force holding the high ground. Junot, a man who had ridden with Napoleon, believed in the irresistible momentum of the French attack. He did not waste time with complex flanking maneuvers or detailed reconnaissance. He saw the redcoats, and he ordered his men to smash them. Junot organized his infantry into the formation that had conquered Europe, the column of attack. These were massive, dense blocks of men, 40 or 50 ranks deep, a human battering ram designed to punch a hole through any enemy line by sheer weight and terror. The French soldiers, confident veterans, marched forward to the beat of drums, their officers urging them on with cries of "Vive l'Empereur!" They advanced through the broken ground, the heat of the Portuguese summer sun beating down on their heavy shakos, kicking up clouds of dust that obscured the deadly surprise waiting ahead. As the French columns lumbered toward Vimeiro Hill and the surrounding ridges, they faced a new and terrifying technological terror. British artillery began to fire, but these were not just solid iron round shots. Major Henry Shrapnel had recently developed a new type of ammunition, spherical case shot, which was effectively a hollow shell filled with musket balls and a timing fuse. These shells burst in the air directly above the French heads, raining lead down upon the packed columns. Gaps were torn in the French ranks before they even came within musket range, yet the discipline of the Grande Armée held. They closed ranks, stepped over their dead, and continued the ascent, convinced that once they reached the summit, their bayonets would make short work of the British. The critical moment arrived as the French columns finally crested the ridges. They were winded from the climb, their formations loosened by the terrain and the artillery fire. They expected to see a terrified enemy breaking before them. Instead, they found emptiness, until a sharp command rang out. Suddenly, the British regiments, notably the 50th and the 97th, rose from the tall grass like spectres. They were deployed not in a block, but in a long, thin line, just 2 men deep. The geometric mismatch was absolute. The French column could only fire from its front 2 rows, perhaps 50 muskets in total. The British line, wrapping around the head of the French column, could bring every single musket to bear, hundreds of them. The order, "Present! Fire!" was shouted, and the British line erupted in a unified, rolling volley. It was described by witnesses as a sheet of flame. The lead ranks of the French column were simply erased, shattered by the concentrated impact of hundreds of heavy lead balls. The French momentum stalled instantly. Before they could recover from the shock, the British reloaded with practiced mechanical speed and fired again. The invincible French column, trapped in its own density, became a slaughter pen. Soldiers in the rear ranks couldn't fire without hitting their comrades in front, and they couldn't advance because the front was collapsing. Panic began to ripple backward. Then, with a roar, the British line lowered their bayonets and charged. The psychological shock was too much. The French columns, the masters of Europe, broke and fled down the slopes in total disarray. The smoke drifted over the ridges of Vimeiro, revealing a battlefield that had become a graveyard for French ambition. The vaunted columns were not just retreating, they were dissolving. Thousands of French soldiers were scrambling back towards the safety of the defiles, leaving behind their artillery, their ammunition wagons, and their wounded. To any competent commander, this was the moment of the pursuit, the most critical phase of battle where a tactical success is converted into a strategic annihilation. A routed army is vulnerable, terrified, and disorganized. If pressed hard, it ceases to be an army and becomes a rabble. Arthur Wellesley, flush with the adrenaline of vindication, saw the chessboard clearly. The road to Lisbon was potentially open, but more importantly, the French retreat lines were exposed. He had General Ferguson's brigade poised on the left flank, relatively fresh and eager to advance. Wellesley rode to the new arrival, Lieutenant General Sir Harry Burrard, who had finally disembarked from his ship, the Brazen, and made his way to the scene just as the firing was dying down. Burrard was a man of the old school, a decent administrator perhaps, but a soldier whose instincts had been dulled by years of garrison duty and the leisurely pace of 18th century warfare. He was elderly, cautious, and completely out of touch with the reality of the ground. He looked at the chaotic field, not with the eye of a predator, but with the caution of a clerk. He saw disorder, he saw risk, and he saw the potential for a reversal of fortune. Wellesley gestured frantically towards the fleeing enemy. He laid out a plan of crystalline brilliance to his superior. He urged Burrard to release Ferguson's brigade immediately to march north and seize the pass at Torres Vedras. If the British held that pass, Junot's army would be cut off from Lisbon. The French would be trapped in the open country with their backs to the sea, sandwiched between the British army and the Atlantic, with no option but total, unconditional surrender. Simultaneously, the main British force would press the centre, driving the French into the waiting net. It was a manoeuvre that could have ended the French presence in Portugal in a single afternoon, capturing an entire Napoleonic marshal and his corps. But Sir Harry Burrard saw only ghosts. He looked at his own army, dusty and tired from the fight. He looked at the distant dust clouds of the French and imagined vast reserves that did not exist. He worried about the lack of British cavalry to screen the advance. Where Wellesley saw a routed mob, Burrard saw a trap. He feared that pushing forward would overextend the British line and invite a counterattack. In a decision that would haunt the history of the campaign, Burrard shook his head. He did not order the advance. He issued the command to halt. The order filtered down the lines, greeted with absolute disbelief by the officers and men. "Pile arms," was the command. The British soldiers, their blood up, watching the backs of their enemies receding into the distance, were forced to ground their muskets and sit in the grass. They watched, impotent, as Junot's shattered forces realized they were not being pursued. The French rallied, reorganized, and slipped away through the very pass that Ferguson could have held. The kill was called off. The tragedy of command was compounded the following morning with the arrival of the third general, Sir Hugh Dalrymple. If Burrard was cautious, Dalrymple was practically paralyzed. As the commander-in-chief, he assessed the situation and, rather than reversing Burrard's error and launching a belated pursuit, he doubled down on the strategy of inaction. He found the situation too precarious, the logistics too uncertain. Despite Wellesley's furious, respectful protests, arguing that every hour of delay gave Junot time to fortify Lisbon, Dalrymple confirmed the halt. The sepoy general had delivered a masterpiece, only to have the canvas slashed by his superiors. The victory at Vimeiro, bought with blood and brilliance, was frozen in place, an unfinished symphony of violence that left the enemy alive to fight another day. With the sword forcibly sheathed by his superiors, the conflict shifted from the ridges of Vimeiro to the negotiation table. It was here that the British command transformed a battlefield triumph into a diplomatic catastrophe. Sensing the hesitation in the British camp, General Junot sent his subordinate, General Kellerman, to discuss terms. Kellerman was a shrewd operator. He arrived at the British headquarters not as a defeated supplicant, but with the bluster of a man who knew his opponents were afraid of a protracted siege. He played on Dalrymple's fears, painting a picture of a French army ready to fight to the last man in the streets of Lisbon, reducing the city to rubble. Dalrymple and Berard, desperate to avoid further risk and eager to report the liberation of Portugal to London, swallowed the bait. They agreed to a treaty that would become infamous in history, the Convention of Sintra. To the astonishment of the junior officers and the fury of the Portuguese allies, the British generals agreed to terms that were practically a reward for the French occupation. Under the convention, the French army was not to surrender as prisoners of war. Instead, they were to be repatriated to France, transported on British Royal Navy ships. They would be ferried home with all the honours of war, allowed to keep their weapons, their artillery, and their horses. But the most galling clause concerned personal property. The French had spent months looting Portugal, stripping churches of gold plate, museums of art, and private homes of valuables. The convention allowed them to keep this plunder, classifying it as the soldiers' personal baggage. The British Navy was effectively reduced to a heavy haulage firm for French thieves, transporting the enemy army back to France so they could be redeployed to fight the British again in Spain or elsewhere. Arthur Wellesley sat in the command tent, seething. He watched as the generals hammered out the details, dismantling the strategic advantage he had secured. When the preliminary armistice was drawn up, Dalrymple ordered Wellesley to sign it. In the rigid hierarchy of the Georgian army, refusing a direct order from a commander-in-chief was tantamount to mutiny. With a heavy hand and a heart burning with resentment, Wellesley affixed his signature to a document he despised. He knew exactly how this would look to the world. He had famously remarked to his staff after the halt at Vimeiro, "Gentlemen, there is nothing for us to do now but hunt red-legged partridges," signalling his belief that the serious war was over and the farce had begun. The implementation of the treaty was a surreal spectacle. British soldiers, who days earlier had been bayoneting French grenadiers, now stood by the docks of Lisbon, watching their enemies board British warships. The French troops marched with heads held high, their knapsacks bulging with stolen Portuguese silver. The local population was apoplectic, screaming insults at the departing French and looking with bewilderment at their British liberators who were facilitating this escape. The victory at Vimeiro had saved the French army from destruction. Junot was returning to Napoleon not in chains, but in a cabin on a British frigate, ready to serve the Emperor again. Wellesley, realizing his reputation was being shackled to this disgrace, wrote to the Secretary of State, desperate to distance himself from the decisions of Dalrymple and Berard. He requested leave to return to England immediately. He felt his utility in Portugal was at an end, suffocated by the incompetence of the old guard. He left the peninsula believing his career might be over, unaware that the true storm was not in Portugal, but gathering in the newspapers and coffee houses of London. The ink on the Convention of Sintra was dry, but the bloodletting was about to begin in the court of public opinion. When the first dispatches from Portugal reached London, the city erupted in jubilation. The Tower of London's guns fired a salute, and church bells rang out across the capital. Britain, starved of good news after years of dominating the seas, but failing on land, finally had a victory. Vimeiro was on everyone's lips. The Redcoats had beaten the French. The myth of Napoleonic invincibility was cracked. But the euphoria lasted only as long as it took for the second packet of letters to arrive, the details of the Convention of Sintra. As the terms of the treaty were published in the newspapers, the national mood darkened instantly. The joy of victory curdled into a venomous rage. The British public read with disbelief that the French army, which they believed to be crushed, was being treated like honoured guests. The idea that the Royal Navy was ferrying French looters and their plunder back to safety was too much to bear. The poets of the day, including Lord Byron, dipped their quills in vitriol, penning verses that savaged the generals. The press ran caricatures depicting Dalrymple and Berard as incompetent buffoons, or worse, as traitors who had sold out the country's honour. The outcry was so deafening that the government could not ignore it. They ordered the immediate recall of all three generals, Dalrymple, Berard and Wellesley, to face a formal court of inquiry. The leadership of the army in Portugal was left in chaos, handed over to Sir John Moore, while the three commanders sailed home to fight for their reputations in the grim halls of the Royal Hospital, Chelsea. The inquiry was a spectacle of high tension. It was not a court-martial, but an investigation into the armistice and convention. For Wellesley, it was a fight for his professional life. He stood before the board, a man of 40, cool and articulate, contrasting sharply with the stammering, defensive testimony of his elderly superiors. Wellesley's defence was simple but devastating. He had won the battle, and he had wanted to pursue. He produced the written orders proving he had been superseded. He made it clear that while he signed the armistice, he did so under the direct command of Sir Hugh Dalrymple, and only after his own plan to cut off the French retreat had been overruled by Sir Harry Berard. Dalrymple and Berard floundered. They tried to justify their caution with vague anxieties about supplies and cavalry, but under the glare of the inquiry, their excuses sounded like exactly what they were: the timidity of men unfit for modern command. They had played by the polite rules of the 18th century manoeuvre warfare, while Wellesley was trying to fight a war of annihilation. The final report of the Board of Inquiry was a masterpiece of political hedging. It exonerated all the generals of criminal misconduct, desperate to avoid a deeper scandal that might bring down the government. However, the true verdict was delivered by the King and the Horse Guards. Sir Hugh Dalrymple was quietly removed from command and never held an active field post again. Sir Harry Berard, likewise, was pushed into obscurity, his reputation permanently stained by the halt at Vimeiro. Arthur Wellesley, however, survived. Though he was formally reprimanded for signing the treaty, the government and the military establishment recognized the distinction. They saw that Vimeiro was his victory and Sintra was their failure. He had proven he could beat the French. He was the only general who had shown the tactical genius and the aggressive spirit needed to confront Napoleon. While his superiors were retired to their country estates to fade into history, Wellesley was kept in reserve. The Vimeiro scandal had cleared the deck. The old guard had been swept away by their own incompetence, leaving the path open for the only man capable of finishing what had been started. While the lawyers and politicians in London dissected the minutiae of the armistice, the true cost of the Vimeiro contention was beginning to manifest on the continent. The strategic debt incurred by Berard and Dalrymple's caution was about to be collected with interest. The most immediate and visceral consequence was the resurrection of the enemy army. The 25,000 French soldiers who had been defeated at Vimeiro did not rot in British prison hulks or languish in captivity. Instead, they were deposited by the Royal Navy at the French ports of Rochefort and La Rochelle. It was a bitter irony that the British taxpayer had essentially funded the refitting of Napoleon's forces. These troops, hardened veterans of the Portuguese campaign, stepped off the British ships, marched to the depots, received new uniforms and fresh supplies, and were immediately reintegrated into the Grande Armée. The very men Wellesley's redcoats had bled to defeat on the ridges of Vimeiro were now back on the board, fully armed and burning for revenge. The British army would have to fight these same battalions again in the bloody years to follow. The failure to annihilate Junot's corps meant that the British had not removed a piece from the chessboard. They had merely allowed it to reset its position. The incomplete victory also had a catastrophic impact on the momentum of the war. In warfare, time is often the most precious commodity, and the British had squandered it. The delay caused by the command confusion and the subsequent evacuation allowed the French strategic picture to stabilize. Had Wellesley been unleashed to chase Junot into the sea, the shockwave might have destabilized the French hold on the entire Iberian Peninsula. The Spanish insurgents, then fighting a desperate guerrilla war, would have been emboldened by the total destruction of a French imperial corps. Instead, the pause gave the French emperor time to react. Napoleon, observing the events from Paris, was furious at Junot's failure, but he was not intimidated by the British performance. He saw a British army that was capable of fighting, but crippled by its own leadership structure. He decided that the Spanish ulcer and the British incursion required his personal attention. Because the British had failed to close the door firmly in 1808, Napoleon himself crossed the Pyrenees later that year with a massive force of 200,000 men. The Armée d'Espagne descended like a sledgehammer. In Lisbon, the British army was left in a state of operational limbo. With Wellesley, Burrard and Dalrymple all recalled to England for the inquiry, command fell to Lieutenant General Sir John Moore. Moore was a gifted soldier, the father of the light infantry, and a man of immense personal integrity. But he inherited a poisoned chalice. The initiative won at Vimeiro was gone. The army was sitting static in Portugal, unsure of its next move, while the French storm gathered in the north. Moore would eventually be forced into a desperate campaign, the famous retreat to Corunna, driven out of Spain by Napoleon's overwhelming numbers. It is one of history's great what-ifs. Had Vimeiro been the decisive, crushing victory Wellesley intended, the French position in 1808 might have collapsed entirely before Napoleon could arrive. The British might have secured the mountain passes and created an impregnable fortress in Portugal months earlier. Instead, the war was destined to drag on for 6 more grueling years. The ghosts of Vimeiro, the escaped French soldiers, and the lost hours haunted every mile of the rocky road ahead. The lesson was being written in blood. In war, a half measure is often more dangerous than no measure at all. For Arthur Wellesley, the months spent in England following the inquiry were a period of intense professional purgatory, but also of crystallization. He had been right, and he knew it. The Vimeiro campaign had been a crucible, burning away his patience with the antiquated traditions of the British military establishment. He had seen firsthand that a modern army, capable of defeating the French, could not be led by a committee of gentlemanly geriatrics. The Council of War, that polite gathering of officers to debate the next move, was, in Wellesley's eyes, an abomination. It was a mechanism for diffusing responsibility and breeding hesitation. During this interlude, while he served as Chief Secretary for Ireland, Wellesley formulated the doctrine that would define the rest of his career. He resolved that he would never again accept a command where his authority was diluted. If he were to fight Napoleon's marshals, he required the powers of a dictator within his own sphere of operations. He needed the ability to hire, fire, advance, and retreat without waiting for a signature from a man who had last seen combat 30 years prior. Vimeiro had taught him that the greatest threat to his army was often not the enemy in front, but the friction from behind. Fate, grim and unyielding, conspired to give him his chance. In January 1809, the news reached London of the disaster at Corunna. Sir John Moore, the man who had taken command after the Sintra scandal, was dead, killed by a cannonball while covering the chaotic evacuation of his army. The British Expeditionary Force had been kicked off the continent. The mood in London was funereal. The government teetered on the brink of abandoning the Peninsular War entirely, viewing it as a hopeless money pit. However, a small faction within the cabinet, led by Lord Castlereagh, believed there was still hope, but only if the right man was sent. They turned back to the sepoy general. Wellesley was asked for a memorandum on the defence of Portugal. His response was a masterpiece of strategic clarity. Unlike the doomsayers, He argued that Portugal could be defended, that its mountainous geography could be turned into a fortress, and that a disciplined Anglo-Portuguese army could bleed the French dry. But the subtext of his acceptance was clear. He would go, but he would go alone at the top. No more Dalrymples, no more Burrards. In April 1809, Arthur Wellesley stepped onto the quintessential stage of his life for the second time. He arrived in Lisbon not as a junior subordinate, but as the undisputed commander of the forces. The psychological shift in the army was immediate. The soldiers, who had seen their victory stolen at Vimeiro, cheered his return. They knew that with the peer, as they called him, back in the saddle, the days of hesitation were over. Wellesley brought with him a new ruthlessness, born from the Vimeiro contention. He reorganized the commissariat, tightened discipline, and began the construction of the massive defensive works that would become the lines of Torres Vedras, the very ground he had wanted Ferguson to seize the year before. He was preparing for a long war, a war of patience and logistics. He had learned that brilliance on the battlefield was useless if the command structure could not exploit it. Vimeiro had been the dress rehearsal where the actors fluffed their lines. Now the curtain was rising on the main performance, and the lead actor was determined to write his own ending. This was the birth of the Iron Duke. Though the title would not be formally bestowed for years, the steel was forged in the frustration of 1808. The commander who returned to Portugal was harder, colder, and infinitely more dangerous. He had seen how easily victory could be thrown away, and he was resolved to hold the reins of war with an iron grip, ensuring that the next time he broke a French army, there would be no one to tell him to halt. The Battle of Vimeiro remains one of the most singular and instructive episodes in the annals of the British Empire. In the grand tapestry of the Napoleonic Wars, it is often overshadowed by the carnage of Waterloo or the brilliance of Salamanca. Yet, as a study in leadership, it is unsurpassed. It stands as a stark granite monument to the dangers of command latency, the fatal lag that occurs when decision-making authority is divorced from situational awareness. The tragedy of August 21st, 1808, was not a failure of courage. The British soldier proved himself the equal, if not the superior, of the French conscript. The redcoats stood their ground against the columns that had conquered Europe, their discipline unbroken, their volleys devastating. Nor was it a failure of tactical conception. Arthur Wellesley had read the terrain and the enemy mind with the precision of a grandmaster. The failure was entirely systemic. It was the collapse of a command structure that prioritized seniority over competence and caution over capitalization. Sir Harry Burrard and Sir Hugh Dalrymple were not villains in the theatrical sense. They were men of their time, operating within the safe, predictable confines of 18th century military doctrine. They believed that preserving the army was more important than risking it for a total victory. But in fighting Napoleon, they were facing a new age of total war, where half measures were death sentences. Their inability to adapt, to trust the man on the ground, and to seize the fleeting moment turned a triumph into a scandal. For the modern observer, Vimeiro offers a chilling reminder that the greatest enemy is often internal. Friction, miscommunication, and a bloated chain of command can do more damage than enemy cannon fire. The Vimeiro contention teaches us that authority must reside with those who can see the battlefield, not those reading reports in the rear. It highlights the delicate balance between prudence and paralysis. Ultimately, Vimeiro was the spark that ignited the Peninsular War. It was the bloody proof of concept that Britain needed. It demonstrated that the French could be beaten. It launched the career of the Duke of Wellington, hardening him into the instrument that would eventually break Napoleon. But it also left a scar on the history of the war, a reminder of the thousands of lives that might have been spared had the British generals simply had the courage to finish what they started. The French army escaped that day, but the lesson did not. It echoes down through the centuries. In war, as in life, opportunity is a perishable commodity. Hesitate for an hour, and you may pay for it for years. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the hidden blunders of the Peninsular War, please leave a like and share this video with fellow history enthusiasts. What do you think? Was Wellesley right to be furious, or were the older generals right to be cautious? Let us know in the comments below. And for more documentary storytelling on the British Empire's greatest conflicts, make sure to subscribe and ring the bell. See you in the next chapter of history.